Hey guys, okay, part two. It's time to talk about essay three, your last essay. Okay, so um, essay three is an analytical research paper. The big difference from essay two is that you're going to be using a whole lot more sources, more kinds of sources, more sources just altogether. But we're still analyzing, right? So that means going beneath the surface, digging out what's not obvious. You're still going to use evidence and you're still going to have a thesis, a debatable thesis, same thing, okay? But this paper is going to be quite a different story because it's going to be a lot longer, right? It's an 8 to 10 page paper, and because it's going to use so many sources. And we are going to we'll talk next week about how to actually go about writing a paper that's this long. But what I want to focus on for today's lecture is the research process and the kind of research I want you guys to be doing. So essay three is you're going to begin the process by coming up with a research question. Posing a question, we'll talk about that in a second. You're going to answer that question using different kinds of research that allow you to look at your question from a variety of angles. You're going to kind of pull that research together, your initial sort of foray into the research with an annotated bibliography, which is just a reference list with a paragraph that summarizes each source. And we're actually going to talk about APA like later in this lecture. And then finally, you'll write the paper. Well, you'll draft it, and then we'll revise it. Okay. So this essay is totally going to be source mania. You're going to use a whole bunch of sources, a minimum of 6, including at least one of each of the following. Everybody's gonna use a scholarly, peer-reviewed academic article from the database Academic Search Premier. That's going to be a secondary source. I'm going to explain all of this and how to use that database later on in this lecture. You're going to find statistics, reliable and unbiased current statistics from a reliable source. And you're also going to use a primary source. Remember how we talked about the difference between a primary source and a secondary source, where secondary sources are cooked, they are analyses, and your primary source is raw, right? So your primary source is something like your commercial for essay 2. So here, that's going to be something that you analyze. It might be a blog or a website. You might do an interview. You might do a survey. It's kind of raw data, raw information that you're going to analyze. Okay. So our goals are going to be to pose a real research question, to do quality research that answers your question from multiple relevant perspectives, to summarize and paraphrase these complex sources, to synthesize multiple sources to prove your thesis, to frame a debatable thesis, to manage lots of sources and pages and thus structure the paper to prove the thesis with good paragraphs, and then to cite all of these sources with both in-text citations and a reference list. Oh my goodness. So we can break it down to this. Research, summarize, synthesize, prove, and cite. Okay. It's a tall order, but it's all we're doing for the rest of the semester. Okay, so let's back it up. Let's talk about the research question, which is where we're going to begin. So this is going to be the task for discussion board number 4. A research question is an honest-to-goodness question, right? That is to say, a question that you don't know the answer to, right? Like a real, legitimate question. A good research question is not going to be so broad that you can't make some headway toward answering it in a paper this long, but it's also not going to be so narrow that you can't fill the pages that you need. It's going to be a good research question is going to require analysis and research in order to be answered, right? So not a yes-no question, not a question that calls mostly for opinion. It's also going to have some kind of a stake that you can argue for, right? There's something significant about this question. And it's a question that's got to be open, right? We're looking for questions that can be answered in a whole lot of different ways. You can see us sort of moving, sort of into the terrain of the idea of debatability again, right? A thesis is debatable because someone might have other ideas. So we're looking for a question that could be answered in different ways. So choosing your question is going to be the task of our next discussion board. And here's, this is going to be a totally open topic paper, right? You guys are going to pick your own topic. But here's the limitation. You have to start with a research question. And that means that you can't choose a topic that you have deep beliefs about, right? So topics that most of us have deep beliefs about, like abortion, the death penalty, drug legalization, these kinds of things. You can't write the paper about that, right? Because you can't start with a research question on one of these topics because you already have a strong belief about it, right? So instead, what I want you to do is to choose a topic that you're curious about, not something that you already have a position on, but something you actually really don't know what you think about yet, right? So something that you actually you don't have a position on, and you want to learn more about it. Okay, so that's an important distinction from the beginning. So if you start like trying to write a paper about legalizing marijuana or that abortion is terrible or good or whatever, I'm going to stop you because that's not what we're going for. So here's some questions for us to kind of take a look at initially. What are the laws regarding gender discrimination? So that's an okay question, but it's a little bit narrow for my taste. I think that like a broader question about is gender discrimination in the workplace something in a real problem today might be better, and investigating the laws would be like one way to do that. The problem is that you can't answer a question about the laws in lots of different ways. Most of the time, there might be exceptions. Let's look at the second one. Why is the death penalty not a legal requirement for first-degree murder? So this question raises some red flags to me because I can tell immediately that this is someone who really believes deeply in the death penalty, and thus I'm not going to let them write on this because that's not the point of this particular paper, right? We're looking for a research question that's open and real, right? A question that you really don't know the answer to on a topic that you don't already have a set opinion about. So that one is going to be out. Okay, so number 3 is why do women live longer than men on average? I think that that's a really good question. I think it's a puzzling one. I think that it's something that there's a lot of possible answers to, and I really don't know. And it's not the kind of thing that people have already like really set opinions about, right? So I think that number 3 could be a really interesting question to consider. Number 4 is, why is there so much gun crime in Chicago? So this is my research question for if I was going to write this paper, that's what I would write on because I as I'm sure I've told you guys, I live in Chicago, and this is something that I really wonder about, like what is going on out there. So that is, I think, an open question, a real question that could be answered in lots of different ways. This last one, why do teenagers feel like it's okay to share highly personal information on Facebook? I think that this question kind of assumes that this person would be able to find some data proving that this is actually happening, but I think this is a question with a lot of potential. It's something that it is kind of puzzling, and that this person, so long as this writer doesn't have a really strong opinion about this could be something really interesting to investigate, to think about the dynamics of sharing information today, especially sharing personal information. So for this next discussion board, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to ask you guys to come up with a research question, to talk a little bit about it, to explain what you're thinking about, and then to have you guys respond to each other. And we will step in and stop people who are trying to write about abortion or the death penalty or something like that, and make sure that we're all starting from a position of open curiosity, right? We really want to research these questions. So the basic idea is for your research, right, is that you're trying to answer your question, right? And you're trying to answer that question by looking at it from as many angles as possible, right? So you're trying to think about all of the possible perspectives and issues and concerns that might go into answering that question. You're gonna focus a lot on using credible sources. That's why I'm having you guys turn in annotated bibliography. Sorry, there's like something going on up there. Um, uh, this is from my hotel room in Beauvais, France. Um, we're gonna focus a lot on using credible sources. And we're gonna, starting next week, once we start kind of getting more into how you're actually going to go about writing this paper. Next week, we're going to look at two essays that I think both model some really good research strategies. An essay by the Dr. Atul Gawande and by a sociologist named Zizi Papakursi about very different topics. But I'm going to ask you guys to sort of look at their articles as examples. So we're going to talk about them in next week's lecture. They'll also be included on this week's homework quiz. And you can find both of them in the required reading folder at Blackboard. So let me just kind of like walk you through how like a sample what you might do, how you might like start approaching a paper like this. So for my research question, right, why are there so many shootings in Chicago? Here's a sort of one possible train of thought for my research. So the first thing I think I would do would be to just try to find out the basic facts, right? I would want to find out like how many shootings there are in Chicago, where those shootings take place, the historical trend. If I can, things like how many of these shootings are solved, how many are not. Maybe statistics about gun ownership. I want to find out start with all the hard data I can get, and probably where I'm going to start is with the Chicago Police Department website, which is a treasure trove of information. So this is one thing to think about is where to start. The Chicago Police Department is a reliable government source. This is not to say that I'm not yet controversial these days. And so I'm certainly going to want to kind of look at some of the groups that critique the police department, but they do collect statistics. Another really good source for stats on this topic is the Chicago Tribune, which I know because I read it, and it has they keep an ongoing map online about where new shootings happen. Just you want to start just by finding the numbers. One really great source for statistical information is the Pew Research Center, and there's a link to it in the reading folder, reading and resources folder. Pew is a think tank that does tons and tons of surveys on all kinds of topics. So it's a really good way to find information about about social topics, about what Americans are thinking about specific topics, about social behavior. So that's a really good place for many of us to start. I'm going to look at Academic Search Premier to see what scholars say, and I'm going to talk more about that in the next segment of this lecture. I'm also going to start just basically doing some searches to find newspaper articles, newspaper and magazine articles in what I know are reputable sources: Time Magazine, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, CNN. Not that I want to trust any of them wholeheartedly, right? I want to be critical about everything that I read, but I'm going to start looking at these sources and then start kind of like, tracking back from there. I should be at that point starting to kind of figure out what the important issues and debates are, right? So, and then doing more Google searches and evaluating websites in order to kind of think more about what might be involved.